Well, good evening. So I'm hoping we have a few more joining us, but we're going to go ahead and get started. I wanted to let you know that we usually have water and a snack for you, but tonight I put out some hot water. So if you'd like to help yourself to a cup of tea, it's amazing. Please do so, but it's amazing what the difference a couple of weeks can make, right? Wasn't I just up here talking about how beautiful the weather is and that you are all wonderful to come inside despite the weather, but now you're invited to come inside because of the weather, and we gather in this warm space together. Well, let me open up with a word of prayer, and then we'll move right on to our speaker. Good and grace-giving God, many of us do not want to be here tonight. We don't want to be here because we don't want to face the loss of a loved one. But somehow, some way, you've seen to it that they're here. I thank you for giving them the courage and the faith and the hope to step inside these doors, even though it's hard and even though it hurts. We thank you for the warmth that this space provides, not only physically, but emotionally and mentally. My hope is that new friendships are being built. People are beginning to know that they're not alone in their grief, and I thank you for that. Lord, continue to strengthen and guide those that mentor and those that are being led to feel and lean into their grief. God, we thank you for the blessings of each day. Help us to see the miracles that you have provided for us. And help us to remember that Jesus, too, wept and grieved. But it was also Jesus who said, please come. I like to gather those and long to gather those like a hen who gathers her chicks. Help us to feel that comfort and warmth of Jesus. Amen. So tonight we have Randy Ruckdaschel with us. He is a former chaplain, recently retired. He has semi-retired, right? Did you see that? Kind of like once a chaplain, always a chaplain. And he has done a variety of things in his life, of which he could probably tell you about, maybe will be part of his story. But what I do know about Randy is he is a compassionate individual. He has a great listening ear, and he is somebody who comes alongside of people who are deep in grief and journeys with them through it. So let us welcome Randy Ruckdaschel.
Thank you. All right, now you guys sat so far back, I'm going to move closer. There we go. Oh, I've got to have my distance. All right, well, good evening and welcome. And thank you for the opportunity to come here this evening. I'm going to kind of introduce myself a little bit here and share a little bit of my grief journey with you first, so we kind of establish some common ground. And then I have a few things I'd like to share with you about grief and loss, and in specific, primary and secondary losses, because there's more than just the initial loss. There's other things that come into play as well. And so, my name is Randy. That's the hard part. You don't have to know the last part. That's a little harder to do. And several of the roles that I've played, much like yourselves, I've been a son, a brother, husband, father, grandfather, and as well as an employee, co-worker, and a chaplain over the years that I've been in service. I started out in leadership development and organizational change, working with a large organization on a global scale, and worked with them for about 30 years, and then another 5 years with another company, and spent a lot of time in change. And I bring that up because there's a lot of similarity between what goes on in navigating change and in navigating grief and loss. Spent a couple years at Lutheran Seminary just a few years ago. Got a master's degree in congregational mission and leadership. Was actually kind of going after the idea of kind of extending my career into taking what I'd learned in change leadership and bringing that into the church. And then that was my plan. God had a different plan. And so in my first year at Luther, I found out that I had to be working in a ministry And so I went to the contextual ed department and said, well, I'm a global specialist in organizational change and leadership development. Where can you use me? And he says, well, we could use you about anywhere, but nobody wants to pay for it. So what else can you do? And he said, we've got a senior care facility in South Minneapolis that just contacted us a couple weeks ago, and they're looking for a chaplain. Could you do that? And I said, well, what does that entail? He says, I don't know, but you'll figure it out. And so I landed, at Minnehaha Senior Living in South Minneapolis as a chaplain and kind of an intern while I was going to seminary. And over the first year, I fell in love with the role. And when I finished up the first year, the chief operating officer of the company that runs the facility came to me and said, you know, you're going to graduate next year with your degree and all, but if you'd be interested, we'd be interested in offering you a full-time position. And I went, oh, really? I'd never expected that. And so when I graduated from Luther, I graduated right into a job as a chaplain. Didn't pay a lot, but I had some of the most wonderful people that I had the privilege of caring for and working with, and it just blew my mind, some of the experiences that I was able to learn. But along with that, I dove deep into an area that I wasn't real comfortable with before then, and that was grief and dealing with end of life and dealing with coaching people towards end of life, but also coaching families afterwards with managing their grief and coaching spouses and so forth with that process. So I worked as a senior care chaplain for about 5 years, and it was 2 years ago almost that I retired. And now I'm repairing or restoring an old car, so having a lot of fun with that. But like you, a friend, a neighbor, and a fellow Christian. And so we all have many roles, and that's just a few of the ones that I've carried that I bring to you today. One of the things we'll talk about as we're moving along is our relationship with our faith. And one of the challenges that I learned about people in the Bible is a lot of people don't recognize that there's a whole book in the Bible where people are not happy with God and they voice their opinions. Let me give you an example. From Psalm chapter 13, it says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death, and my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken. But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." Grief is a painful experience where we can feel very alone, very vulnerable, very small, and downright abandoned by God. Like the psalmist in this reading, we are angry and disappointed. To whom can we make our complaint? Who will listen? Who will care? God will. So my grief story goes something like this. As a young boy growing up in Minnesota, I experienced loss in a few different situations. I had grandparents that died when I was very young. I had classmates that died. I remember one gal dying of leukemia when I was in like 5th grade, which was really kind of strange. It was my first introduction to the Catholic Church because we went to the service, and I had never been in that type of an experience before growing up as a Lutheran boy. But I had other people that had died, and most of them weren't too close to me. They were a little more distant. And so I could experience that loss and I could deal with it, but it wasn't quite as personal. Then as a young adult, literally 18 years old, and going into my senior year of high school, in fact, coming to the last half of that senior year, all of a sudden my father passed away. He was 45 years old. His heart literally blew up. He wasn't going to make it. He didn't make it. And that shook my world. That was like a volcano or an earthquake all at once. Everything about my life was up for grabs all of a sudden. If you remember that time of your life, there's a lot of opportunities opening up, and you're trying to make choices. And I was leaning on my old dad as a rock and kind of using him as a measuring stick and as a, Dad, what do you think about this, and so forth. And suddenly, he wasn't there. I also saw him as the patriarch of the family. He wasn't there. I saw him as the financial security of the family. He wasn't there. Everything kind of changed all of a sudden. And that's when I started to really understand grief. It was sudden, it was unexpected, it was intimate, it was disruptive, it was unfair. I remember screaming how unfair it was at the funeral. I was upset. It was unnatural. And I put that in quotes because it was about as natural as you can get. But it was unnatural for someone of that age to die, someone who was that healthy, at least in appearance to us, when in fact he wasn't. And it was a surprise, something that was hard to deal with. So I was dealing with anger, fear, and disorientation. When your world gets rocked in a grief situation, you can become completely disoriented. All the anchors that you look for suddenly dissolve or disappear or aren't as relevant as they once were. Well, I shook you up a little bit with Psalm 13. I thought I'd bring one that's a little more comforting into play. Psalm 23, and I will admit I'm not as satisfied with the New Revised Standard Version of it as I am with the King James, but I did pull the New Revised Standard Version for today. It reads, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, the valley of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long." The Psalms can provide a comfort as well as a guidance on how we can connect and communicate with God and how we can trust God to accept our frailty, our anger, our frustration, our disorientation. We can turn to God, and God will listen. And in fact, it's funny that on Psalm 13, some people say, well, that just seems unfaithful. Wait a minute. It's as faithful as you can get because the person took the time to bring it to God. That means they believe. There's no way around that. So let's talk about grief a little bit. So grief, in a clinical sense, it's a range of physical, emotional, and spiritual responses to loss. Loss of loved ones, relatives, acquaintances. Sometimes that loss involves a loved one who dies, divorces, moves away, changes in some dramatic way. And at other times, the loss can be a job, a house, a friend, physical ability, a memory, or anything that has become a part of who we are and how we live. Whether a person or a perception, the loss is very real to us, and the grief responses can range from simple sorrow and mild depression to physical and emotional disability. Grief is normal. It's natural. It is usually not a disease or an affliction that needs to be prevented or cured. It is a process that needs to be experienced and integrated into the new reality in which we live. The new reality. And so at the very base of grief is loss. Loss. Anything or anyone that was once part of our life and today is no longer. Triggered by an event or a situation and can be direct or indirect. So most of you have experienced a loss. How many experienced a loss of a child? Show of hands, okay. How about a loss of a spouse? Okay. Loss of a grandchild? Friend? Pet? Okay. Each of these is painful and disruptive to our lives on their own, but there are also further losses. It's kind of like you throw a stone in the pond and you see the ripples go out, and the ripples hit other things, and then they divide into more ripples and so forth. Grief can be a lot like that. Loss can be a lot like that. The main loss sends those ripples through your life, and it hits every aspect and then bounces off and creates more ripples. And they're all just as painful and disruptive and need to be addressed. Let me explain a little further. The article that I gave you, and if you didn't pick it up, they're out front, and it's called, let me see on the front cover, thank you, Understanding Grief. I found this article on the internet, my favorite source, okay? And this particular one is produced by the Grief Journey UK is what it's called. So this is out of Europe. But it's a great article on distinguishing primary and secondary grief. And so what I've done for our talk this evening is just pulled some highlights for you, just to kind of give you a feeling for it, and then encourage you to read the article if you get a chance later and see how it applies to your situation. So distinguishing primary and secondary loss. So primary loss is that initial loss. I like to think of it as the trigger event. That individual that passed suddenly and took your breath away, your heart with it probably, and began the shaking in your life. It's important, it's intense, and it's difficult. It's visible and recognized by others, and that's the blessing in the situation. Others know that loss and share in that loss in some cases with you, and can be with you, be present with you in that loss as you navigate your way. It's about the what or the who that's been lost on the primary. On the secondary, it's the subsequent or related loss. It's that additional ripple in the pond. It's also important, intense, difficult, but it's often not visible or recognized by others. They don't see that one. They don't see, not that one, all of those. And I say that way because you recognize that graphic in the corner? What is that? An iceberg. What do we know about icebergs? Most of it. How much of it's underwater? Anybody know? Yeah, 80 to 90%. Yeah, 80 to 90% below the water. And what part of the iceberg is most dangerous to the ships in the sea? The stuff above the water or the stuff below? Stuff below. And so your primary and secondary grief is a lot like that. The primary grief is the stuff people can see, but in fact probably only represents about 10% of what you're dealing with. The secondary grief is the stuff under the surface, the stuff they can't see as well, the stuff that hurts even more sometimes. And it's hard because no one else recognizes it, or few others recognize it and help you with it along the way. And so it's important for you to be able to distinguish it so that you can begin to deal with it. So connections, identity, relationships, secondary losses not being visible are not as recognized by the other folks. And like the bulk of the iceberg below the surface, our secondary losses can be more numerous and impactful than our primary loss, and nobody may notice. And even when we even may be disregarded or discounted by those that live around us, which then increases our grief and our struggle. A little closer look at secondary losses. So what are they? And here's just some general examples to work with, and then I'm going to ask you to kind of think about what are some examples that you might be dealing with. But let me give you these first. So relationships. So when you lose a spouse, you've lost a companion, a partner, okay? And at first, it seems like, all right, I've lost whomever that is, but we don't recognize all the roles that they played and all the ways that we interacted with that person, okay? And so that relationship, the companionship, the shared activities, and the chores, okay? I was sharing this with my wife, and she says, oh, my lawnmower. The person who took care of the lawn for me, okay? Or actually the one that was really important for her is, oh, the grocery buyer, okay? There's, they seem silly on the surface, but they're important. Some of them are, some of them might seem silly, but others aren't as silly. So material things, financial security, that was the stuff that started rocking my world when I lost my dad. Okay, what's going to happen to the family? Lifestyle, work and skills, the things that that person brought to the partnership or brought to the relationship. Functional roles, caregiver, bill payer, lawnmower, grocery shopper, support systems, connections to benefits and services. When I pass, I've tried to make sure that my wife has access to funds and so forth, so I've tried to arrange for that. But for her, that's going to be a transition. It's a role that she's going to have to take on, and she's going to need help with that when the time comes. And the thing that I think is really hurtful sometimes is the hopes, the dreams, and the expectations. Okay? I remember when my father passed, there were so many hopes and dreams that I had. I knew how much he loved his children, and I knew how much he loved watching little children in the neighborhood, and I so much wanted him to see his grandchildren. And he never even met his in-laws because he died so young, and we were all so young. And so the hopes, the dreams, and expectations can be sometimes the most hurtful things to deal with and to struggle with. So what are some of the secondary losses that you deal with or have dealt with? Anybody willing to share? Oops. Oh. Oh, so he had a role. Yeah, he had a role with your parents, and now that is no longer there.
Yeah, when he died, it's been almost 9 years, so.
Yeah.
But now that they're older,
Yeah.
it's like, I wish Jeff was here to help.
Help along with that. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Any others, please?
I know when I die, my husband doesn't drive a car anymore.
Oh,
Lord, is he going to have a big change?
yeah. Transportation. Yeah. And that's going to compound itself. It's not just transportation, but he'll become isolated. And when we become isolated, what's it? No, he won't. But that's the risk, right? Yeah. So, and we see that when I was working in the care facilities, one of the things we watch for is people that were no longer coming down for activities, and we could go and check, and we could find things like they'd lost their sight or their hearing, had made major change, and so they stopped socializing. When they stop socializing, there's been statistics that dementia gets accelerated when people stop being part of community, and so we can try to keep them active and so forth to try to keep that from happening. So there's those trigger effects that happen. Yeah. Secondary losses. Anyone else willing to try? Please.
We lost a daughter, and she won't be there to see her daughter graduate, get married, have a family, and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's hopes and dreams, that's processes. There's so many different places that connects on, isn't it? Yeah. And yet there's room for a new plan. There's room for a new plan. And that's something we'll get to in a few moments here. I'm surprised that nobody brought up we're coming into the holiday season. The most dreaded time of year for people struggling with grief, right? Because it's on an open wound, like sandpaper, okay? It's hard. And yet, it's also an opportunity to maybe do something a little different and to break away from those traditions that are too painful to try to carry on, but do something different and celebrate the person in that way. Let me carry this a little further. Grief journey, let me check. Oh, got to check my time. How am I doing?
Got about 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, this is good. So grief journey, this is just an acknowledgement. It's kind of a disclaimer on my part, but everyone experiences grief uniquely and finds their own path and rate for navigating their journey. So the key up here on this slide that I want to try to make sure you know is I'm about to give you a tool to use, but I want you to recognize that may or may not work for you. and it may work differently for you than it works for you, if it works at all. Okay? And so I'm not trying to give you some kind of mysterious solution in that way. First of all, real quickly, I'm going to build this real fast. What we recognize is that as we're going through this grief process, it's like, we call it a dip that happens, okay, emotionally. And so it starts with this slope of loss, and we see some of the examples of a traumatic response on the left-hand side: surprise, denial, anger, rejection, bargaining. And then at some point, we reach this turning point or transition point where we start making our own choices. We start moving in a positive direction, taking responsibility to move forward, letting go of some things from the past. But I'm not telling you to let go of everything. I'm saying that we need to let go of some things, but we need to hold on to some things as well. And then embracing a new reality or a new approach. And then finally, on the gain and growth trajectory, hope, acceptance, opportunity, connection, and investment towards the future. We're putting our time and energy. The key I wanted to get to with this is it's a slope, and you'll notice I did not put a gauge on it, because for some, this might be months. For some, it might be years. Okay? It could be different for each person in the room. But this is what I wanted to get to before I run out of time. Okay? And I think this is a handout that's blue in color, and it's a little bit more expounded on in the paper. And the idea with Get Air is this. It's just a simple strategy, something you can try. A lot of people tell me when they're dealing with grief that it's like feeling like you're being suffocated or drowned. And so the idea with this is, all right, let's get some air. And so we start with God. And we start with God by saying, you know what? I don't control anything and everything. And so I need to kind of let go and let God do his thing or her thing. And so we begin with prayer. And prayer can be us communicating to God, or we can be communicating with God. And I say that because too often we forget that prayer can be listening as much as speaking. Okay? And just spending quiet time in listening. Sharing our pain and our hopes, that's why I shared Psalm 13 with you. There are many more psalms like that. And they're great to kind of show that it's okay to yell, okay? It's okay to get frustrated. It's okay to tell God how you feel. And in fact, it's honest. And that's what God respects and appreciates. And so read the Psalms and find some that connect with you, and keep them in your prayers as you do. And know that God is listening. The second step, expectations. Manage your expectations. Take your time. Don't force yourself forward, but take one step forward each day in some way. And don't allow others to set massive expectations for you. Recognize they're doing it out of love, but they're not feeling what you're feeling. I used to tell people when confronting somebody that's had a major loss, do not walk up, put your arm around them and say, I know exactly how you feel. It's a good way to get a black eye. Okay? All right? Because no one else knows how you feel. And so don't let them try to push you by telling you how to feel. Give thanks. And here's an interesting thing. This seems counterintuitive, but that's why I put it on here. Giving thanks for the gifts that this person or people represents in your life. They have been a gift to you, and they have left you with gifts. Gifts of experiences, memories, of wisdom, of insight, perspective. There's so many things that they've given you, and there's more. And so find those gifts and find a way to recognize those and celebrate those. And then avoid situations that you can't handle. If Thanksgiving is just going to be too much for you, then don't go. Okay? Find something else to do. I had a dear friend who was a member here for many, many years, and she lost her husband suddenly a number of years ago, and from that day forward, she could never come to an All Saints worship service, which is next Sunday, right? Okay? She couldn't come because she knew it was more than she could handle. And so she just let people know, it's nothing personal, I just can't be there. Okay? Let's see here. Ignore irritants. You're going to be extra sensitive. And so things are going to happen that are going to bug you and are going to tick you off and are going to trip your wire and you're going to blow up. Avoid those things. Get away from them. Ignore them, okay? Don't set yourself up for that failure. Isolate or insulate yourself from those things or those people, if that's what it is. And then replace. Replace activities and traditions with new things. And here's again where I come back to that, the gifts thing. Replace them with activities and traditions that celebrate the gifts, okay? When my father died, one of the things I did do was I grabbed my grandfather's old 1950 Willys Jeep, and after almost 72 hours of no sleep, of making funeral arrangements and getting family members home and all of that stuff, I just took it on me, and I figured it had to be done, so I might as well do it, doggone it. And I did, but I was ready to collapse. So I grabbed the old Jeep, and I drove it away from the house, got away from all of the people, all the irritants and all the stuff, parked it by a lake, got up on the hood, leaned back against the windshield, and prayed. A new activity, a new tradition, and I still do that today. I get away, take a retreat, and do it. Remember those gifts. So that's the heart of what I wanted to share with you tonight. I would like to close with this, and this is a prayer that comes right from 2 Corinthians, where Paul is saying goodbye to the congregation to whom he's writing, and it goes like this. Finally, brothers and sisters, farewell. Put things in order. Listen to my appeal. Agree with one another. Live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you. Greet one another with a holy kiss. All the saints greet you. The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with all of you. Amen. Go in peace. Thank you.